For those of you who don't know me, I was an active trade unionist for most of my life. I've recently retired from my job as the Northwest Regional Manager of the RMT. I'm on the Morningstar Management Committee and the Cuba Solidarity Campaign. And I'll continue supporting all anti-imperialist struggles like this one as well. 3 years ago, I was invited to visit China, and it was the most amazing experience of my life. I support the Friends of Socialist China as well as No Cold War Britain. So that's a bit about me. But I'm not speaking first. I am pleased, though, that our good friend Francisco Dominguez is. He was a political refugee from Pinochet's Chile. And whilst living in the UK, he's been very active on Latin American issues as the head of the research group on Latin America at Middlesex University. He has written extensively on the contemporary Latin America affairs. He is co-author of Right-Wing Politics in the New Latin America. He is also National Secretary of the Venezuela Solidarity Campaign in the UK. He's been speaking at so many meetings over the years, but especially since August, when the US began its naval deployment and attacks on the boats off the Caribbean coast of Venezuela, and then on USA's disgraceful attack on Caracas on the 3rd of January. We are delighted that he can join us today. He's a great man. Over to you, Francisco.
Thank you very much for that, Bob, and thank you very much for inviting me. I decided I'm going to read my contribution. Normally I don't do that because of the time. So every time when somebody uses a second language in speaking, the quality deteriorates, but let's hope it works okay. On the 3rd of January 2026, Trump ordered a military attack on Venezuela that involved the bombing of 4 cities. He focused on Caracas, where President Maduro was staying. US soldiers killed in cold blood all of the members of the Presidential Guard, including 32 Cuban soldiers who had been assigned to Venezuela on an internationalist mission, in the fulfillment of which they gave their lives. US Special Forces brutally kidnapped President Maduro and his wife, Celia Flores. They were beaten up, dragged on the floor, and they may have broken ribs. Celia appeared in the New York court with a swollen black eye and band-aids on her face. The US mobilized about 150 military aircraft, F-32, F-35 helicopters and bombings, plus an unknown number of soldiers that came from about 20 US military bases or military facilities in the area, Puerto Rico, Trinidad and Tobago, Guyana, Panama, etc. Trump justified the deployment of the US war fleet and the military attack on Venezuela by falsely accusing President Maduro of narco-trafficking and narco-terrorism, claiming that Venezuela was run by the inexistent Cartel de los Soles. However, Trump's rhetoric quickly focused on taking control over Venezuela's oil, the world's largest reserves of which. Thus, the real purpose of the military operation was regime change to take possession of Venezuela's oil industry. Trump's pardoning Juan Orlando Hernandez, former president of Honduras, serving a 45-year sentence by a U.S. court in a U.S. prison for having shipped 400 tons of cocaine into the U.S., shows how bogus U.S. accusations of trafficking against Venezuela are. Trump himself and Stephen Miller, his fascist ideologue, claimed that since the U.S. had created Venezuela's oil industry, its nationalization in 1976 was the largest, and I quote, was the largest recorded theft of American wealth and property. I quote, this is consistent with the U.S. Helms-Burton law that argued that all the nationalizations carried out by the Cuban Revolution amounted to robbery. The law supports litigation against Cuba's completely legal and justified nationalizations. Trump's behavior and that of his State Secretary Marco Rubio exude a colonialist mentality by demanding total surrender, claiming they are running Venezuela from the US. Both have threatened Delcy Rodriguez, Venezuela's interim president, with a second military strike if she does not obey. The Venezuelan government faces an extraordinarily delicate and difficult situation. It is negotiating with Trump literally with a gun pointed at his head. The colonialist framework, this colonialist framework has been explicitly formulated in the White House National Security Strategy, issued on the 25th of November 2025, where in page 5, it unambiguously states, and I quote, "We want an hemisphere that remains free of hostile foreign incursion or ownership of key assets and that supports critical supply chains, and we want to ensure our continued access to key strategic locations. In other words, we will insert and enforce a Trump corollary to the Monroe Doctrine," end quote. That is, the United States intend to expose its total dominance over Latin America by means of the Trump corollary, i.e., gunboat diplomacy. The same arguments have been put forward year after year by the Southern Command in its annual report to the Senate's Armed Force Committee. Because of regimes, I'm quoting the Southern Command, because of regimes like those in Cuba, Venezuela, Nicaragua, and others, by having trade relations with non-hemispheric malignant forces, Russia, but particularly China, according to the US, represent an existential threat to the United States, have allowed them to be present in what they say is our hemisphere. The Southern Command Commander-in-Chief, Admiral Alvin Hosley, on the 13th of February 2025, argued the following. Over the course of the last decade, the US has focused predominantly on the Indo-Pacific, while China is taking a global approach. The Latin American Caribbean region is on the front lines of a decisive and urgent contest to define the future of our world. China is assailing US interests from all directions, in all domains, and increasingly in the Caribbean archipelago. A potential offensive island chain. Failure to adequately compete here and now will leave the region under the influence of a chief authoritarian rivals, which directly threaten the United States' shift to the Indo-Pacific, jeopardizing freedom of maneuver, access, and influence in our near abroad, end quote. Therefore, the United States intends to be prominent in the Western Hemisphere is a condition of our security and prosperity. Quote, "We will deny non-hemispheric competitors the ability to position forces or other threatening capabilities or to own or control strategically vital assets in our hemisphere," end quote. Venezuela not only has the largest reserves of oil in the world, it's been a major force for progressive change, regional integration, and anti-imperialism, leading Latin America to assert its collective sovereignty from US imperialism, and it happens to be on the front line of US imperialism enemies. The US has lost the fierce strategic competition with China. It faces a steep economic decline and has major structural obstacles to recover its hitherto formidable economic supremacy. Thus, it is determined to maintain its supremacy by military means. All the wars and sanctions against numerous countries, Venezuela, Cuba, Russia, Iran, Nicaragua, just to mention a few, and in fact, US aggressive actions against multipolarity and ultimately against China. After the kidnapping of President Maduro, Trump and Rubio are going against Cuba. Trump intends to impose tariff on import from countries that sell supply oils to Cuba. The US has deployed 2 warships to the north of Cuba. This is gunboat diplomacy on steroids. Furthermore, the United States has massively expanded its military bases in the Western Hemisphere, Argentina, Chile, Guyana, Trinidad and Tobago, Panama, Colombia, Peru, Honduras, El Salvador, Ecuador, and so on. US imperialism is forging strong alliances with far-right currents in the region, Bolsonaro, Milei, Bukele, Kass, Noboa, and is offering US military protection to right-wing governments through the installation of military bases, thus guaranteeing their power in exchange for colonial submission. In his third policy paper, in contrast, third paper in Latin America and the Caribbean, China presents a stark contrast approach between the US and China about Latin America and Caribbean as a clash between two architectures, all of which I think is worth quoting at length. One treats Latin America and the Caribbean as co-authors of global governance, embedded in the global south, and entitled to diversify their economic, financial, and diplomatic relations without permission from a hegemon. The other treats the hemisphere as a strategic rear base whose primary function is to remain aligned, disciplined, and close to alternatives. When China speaks of development assistance without political conditions, it is not simply offering money or projects. It is directly challenging a century-old system of conditionality, sanctions, financial choke points, and elite mediation that has allowed external powers to veto popular development from afar. When the United States speaks of security, it invokes a world that in the lived history of the Americas has too often meant security for capital, for compliant oligarchies, and for the machinery that intervenes whenever popular forces threaten to convert land, labor, and resources into public dignity. I'm finished with this. We demand the withdrawal of the US fleet illegally deployed in the Caribbean, no war on Venezuela, no war on Cuba, no war on Latin America, and for the immediate and unconditional release of President Nicolás Maduro and Celia Flores. Thank you.
Mika Nhondo Erskog lives and works in a different time zone and is extremely busy, including travelling today. But she has recorded her contribution for the meeting, and we very much appreciate that. Mika is a researcher and editor at Tricontinental, the Institute for Social Research, and she's a coordinator of the Tricontinental Pan-Africa office, where she co-wrote a recent dossier entitled Sahel Seeks Sovereignty.
I'm also a member of No Cold War, the International Committee's organizational group, and I'm so grateful for the opportunity to just say a few words. I'm sorry I couldn't be there in person, but I'm sure you're having a wonderful event, and I look forward to hearing back on what the discussion went like. Thank you to No Cold War Britain and all the participants, the panelists, for joining in this particular moment. We know now more than ever we have to be clear about what is the principal contradiction, what is the principal enemy in the world, and who is advancing humanity's interests and who is not, and what does it look like. So in this moment, of course, many of us waking up on January 3rd, both were shocked but didn't expect, but not unexpected or not surprised. But the important thing for us now as we go forward is we need to understand what actually is the balance of forces at this moment and how we can push for a greater understanding of what's really happening in the world. And I'll talk a little bit about what's happening in the African continent and how an attack on Venezuela is an attack on the sovereignty of people in the global south and an attack on people who are trying to pursue any degree of development, of self-determination in the world. And my thinking and our thinking at Tricontinental is largely framed by a study we did in 2024 called Hyperimperialism, a Dangerous and Decadent New Stage. And we offered this as a discussion, as a reference point. It's by no means a kind of conclusive study. It's more an invitation for us to have a serious collective thinking around the nature of imperialism today. And what we found is due to the US's relative waning economic hegemony, and I'm like relative, it still dominates in chips, in high technologies. It still dominates, of course, in military spending and military developments, but it has lost a significant degree of hegemony in the productive areas of manufacturing, etc. And due to this, it now has limited ways to economically coerce people in its historically more subtle and debt dependency, etc., which still is pervasive. But now it has to resort to more extreme measures of economic coercion that borders and is very much economic warfare, and use militarized forms of responses to social and political problems. And so in this study, there are two things I want to mention before I get into what the situation in Africa is and what the impact of this moment has been. Is one, that we found in our study that the US garners a huge amount of military spending, or does a lot of military spending, and historically this has been underreported. In the 2022 figures, whilst SIRPI, the Stockholm Institute for Peace Research, I think they did around 800 to 900 billion. Our researchers, Gisela Cernadas and John Bellamy Foster, they did a collaborative research, and just using US, Bureau of Statistics, etc., public things that are in the public record, they found that the US was spending double that, around 1.4 trillion, 1.5 trillion. And so the US had, not only is it a big military spender, but it also garners the military spending and resources of NATO and various European economies, as well as some vassal states to an extent like the Philippines. And so what we wanted to make clear is that in this moment, even though the US is in relative economic decline, and has been for a couple of decades in terms of their ability to export capital, because they're not actually have any productive forces anymore, or dominant productive forces, is that whilst they have this economic decline, whilst China has been rising and is a leading economy and playing an important role for many global south countries who are looking for alternative forms of funding, especially in Africa, where you're not tied to conditional loans, etc., it still has this massive military apparatus, and it is clearly using it to try to discipline the world, as it has these last forms of coercion that it historically did not necessarily overly rely on in the last 100 years, because it had enough power of the dollar and economic sway, etc. So that was one. The second is that the US operates with a kind of global north bloc. The rest of Europe, etc., they all fall under the US's mandate and have not been able, European leaders have not been able to show an independent plan from Europe that doesn't subvert or subordinate their national and people-centered interests. And so in this moment, the US military-led bloc is an extremely dangerous force in the world, as we've already seen in the first few weeks of January, but that it's doing so because of its failure to maintain economic hegemony in the world. Importantly is that an attack on Venezuela means an attack on the rest of the global south, or an attack on the global south who are seeking development, sovereignty, their own path, their own democratic models, their own choices. And but importantly, hyper-imperialism, and I think this is where Trump, his kind of the way the media is framing his characteristics is about a madman. But number one is that hyper-imperialism isn't just like a war or a point in history when crazy people get to make crazy decisions, but it's a system. Hyper-imperialism means that the US increasingly relies on a stacked toolkit, which is, tariffs, sanctions, debts, and currency power, diplomatic threats, information operations. And in Africa, we've seen a sustained pattern of, trade preferences, where trade preferences are leveraged, where some states are punished or some states are rewarded in terms of market access. We see this in terms of the tariffs as a disciplining tool, where you shock a targeted economy, and this generates a lot of internal pressure that leads to, internal instability, coups, delegitimation of important political processes. We've, of course, seen the role of AFRICOM, the United States' foreign military presence in Africa, where security partnerships have actually deepened dependency, where the kind of training and intelligence and, drones and basing, etc., largely function as a gendarme of capital and of US economic interests in the region. We've seen this particularly in the west of Africa. And we also seen these kind of selective counter-strike or counter-terror strikes that actually have begun to normalize extreme violence on African soil more than it already was. But maybe some of you have seen at the end of last year in Nigeria, after the US State Department basically claimed that there was a Christian genocide occurring in Nigeria, the US swooped in, bombed a part of the region without necessarily having any kind of forms of transparent steps or clear a clear partnership that actually comes from the Nigerians. This was the Nigerians under pressure and who can't say no to the US because of their economic dependency, seeing a foreign military basically on the basis of a so-called Christian genocide when it refuses to recognize the genocide it has perpetuated and has led in Gaza. So we see this double standard, and we see that the impact is African countries having to bow to these kinds of machinations because we have limited limited power, limited economic, limited political power. And of course, economic coercion has been really extreme on the continent, where, or rather, let me not say extreme, economic coercion has taken on also a new quality with Trump's tariffs. And we saw this in how he tried to discipline South Africa. When South Africa took an incredibly important and disciplined position in pursuing criminal charges against Benjamin Netanyahu, against the Zionist state of Israel, in 2025, Trump administration, he imposed a 30% tariff on South African imports. With a lot of the public estimates were warning that this was going to have a major labor impact, that hundreds and thousands of jobs, especially in export-linked sectors like agriculture and auto manufacturing, which is basically what our bread and butter is, would be affected. And so this is in the context also of South Africa having an extremely high unemployment rate. This kind of tariff shock isn't abstract because it lands squarely on working class communities who are already stretched to the limit in a society that's highly unequal. So this is what hyper-imperialism looks like economically. It's not necessarily invasion in the African continent always, even though in Nigeria it sort of had a military, it's not an invasion, but it had a military approach. But it is a policy shock that can throw tens and thousands of people out of work. It can force a state to change its foreign policy, and it warns others that if you step out of line, your people will pay the price. And so the attacks that on Venezuela, which obviously are more immediate and are more linked to the geography of where Venezuela lies, especially in terms of its political project, we see that the hybrid war that they use and hybrid warfare tactics that it uses in Venezuela are highly applicable to the rest of the world, and much of the world has begun to experience it, or has experienced it in this new phase where it's a lot more coercive, a lot more diabolical and despicable, because it's also clearly having a more precise, targeted political function. Last thing I will say, because I think I'm running out of time, is that this is not going unnoticed, and this is of course receiving a strong response and feeling from working class organizations in Africa. I think it was on 24th of January, the National Union of Metal Workers of South Africa, which basically represents around 460,000 workers, marched to the US consulate in Johannesburg in solidarity with Venezuela against US aggression. And the General Secretary, Irvin Jim, made the political point with real clarity that defending Venezuela is defending sovereignty, because he warned that I think he said, today it's Venezuela, but tomorrow it will be South Africa. And many people truly believe that, because South Africa has an anti-imperialist, a relatively good foreign policy in terms of taking strong positions on issues like the Israeli genocide in Gaza. But it also has historically played an important anti-imperialist role and a kind of guiding conscience in the region, particularly because it has a very rich working class, organizationally based movement culture. And even I think this is powerful that South Africans see this and mobilize quickly, because it reflects the lived experience that South African workers can see how tariffs and trade threats operate as political weapons, and they recognize the pattern when it was deployed against Venezuela, when it has been deployed against Venezuela, Cuba, and others for decades. And this is precisely the kind of solidarity we need to build in Britain and Europe, and not out of moralism or charity, but because it's a shared strategy against the same system that is hyper-imperialism. So I just want to end with a couple of tasks for the anti-war movement. that we need to connect is, I think we need to build this kind of no to tariffs as a collective punishment, continue to build that. We need to continue to say no to AFRICOM's militarization of African sovereignty. We need to say no to strikes and interventions that are dressed up as humanitarian interventions. I mean, it's 2026. We have ample evidence that those initiatives don't work. In fact, the Alliance of Sahel States, which is made up of Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, were one part of the region that was seeing how these US and French securitized partnerships weren't actually helping to reduce the jihadist extremist violence in the region, because that is a structural issue. The increase in jihadist extremism is a structural response to a system that's unable to deal with people's economic and social needs. And so we need to continue to build concrete solidarity with these mobilizations, with days of action, but we also need to push within our national borders against any hint of these types of forms of economic coercion, because ultimately it's the working people of the world, the poor, who bear the brunt of this. So the principle is the same everywhere, that no country is a backyard, no people are expendable, and sovereignty is non-negotiable. Thank you very much.
Well, John is the winner of China's highest national prizes for foreign experts working in China and for foreign writers on China. He is an author of 3 books published in Chinese: The Great Chess Game, Don't Misread China's Economy, and Changes Unseen in a Century, and in English, of the China's Great Road. Don't Misread China's Economy was included in the key theme publications of the Publicity Department of the Communist Party of China Central Committee, which says everything about how good his writing is. He's a senior fellow at Chongyang Institute for Financial Studies at Renmin University of China, and he's a great asset to the No Cold War campaign. John, over to you.
Okay, thank you very much, Bob. What I want to look at is to treat what is happening in the world not as a series of incidental, separated incidents. What is the integrated connection between the two? Because there was a pattern. It's not correct. Obviously, we have to deal with the specificity of each of these situations with Venezuela, Cuba, Iran, etc. But they're all connected to each other, and they're connected by what is happening to the situation in the United States. It's well known that the United States is suffering economic decline, relative economic decline, most spectacularly to China, but not only to China, to a series of large developing global South countries, which is another step forward for humanity, that the global South is becoming not merely at the time of the original Banding Conference, for example, it could make political protests but didn't have great economic weight. It's a great step forward that it now has got great economic weight in the world. But this has led to the illusion amongst some people that the United States would accept this economic decline and we would somehow gradually move into multipolarity. And this is some of the reactions which is taking place to what has happened with Venezuela and Cuba. And there are wrong interpretations of what Trump is doing. Because on the one hand, Trump seems to be doing a series of irrational things, threatening to seize Greenland, attacking Venezuela, insulting allies, and at the same time trying to negotiate peace with Russia. But these are all actually connected. It is not at all the case that what the United States is going to do is peacefully accept its economic decline. It is going to attempt to use its military power to try to offset this. And this, therefore, makes the situation in the world very dangerous, because although the United States' economic decline is very real, in real terms, it's no longer even the largest economy in the world. China is the largest economy in the world. And its decline in the terms of the global South, other rapidly growing global South countries like India, Indonesia, Vietnam, etc. Its military power is very real. Its military power is spending is equivalent to next 9 largest countries in the world put together. That's the degree of its military strength. That's what it attempts to do in order to to offset its economic decline. Therefore, I want to look at these illusions that people have that somehow I read that the United States is retreating into the Western Hemisphere. Well, it's certainly intending to attack the Western Hemisphere, in addition to the actions it's making clear around Venezuela and the actions which are taking place in Cuba at the present time. You can read the two fundamental strategy documents which the United States has published during the last couple of months. One is the National Security Strategy, and one is the National Defense Strategy. Certainly, as regards Latin America, it's unequivocal. I read from the National Security Strategy. After years of neglect, the United States will reassert and enforce the Monroe Doctrine to restore American preeminence in the Western Hemisphere. In other words, the 670 million inhabitants of Latin America and the Caribbean are going to be reassigned unilaterally to the US backyard. So there's no doubt about what that's doing, which incidentally is an attack on the whole people of Latin America, because the reason what the United States wants to do, again, read its goals in Latin America, again, a quote from the security strategy, we want other nations to see us as their partner of first choice, and we will, through various means, discourage their collaboration with others. We should make every effort to push out foreign companies that build infrastructure in the region. What that means is that the Latin American people are going to have to purchase more expensive American goods, and they're going to have less efficient and more expensive American contractors in order to try to keep out, in order to prevent the US decline. So that's a direct attack on the people of Latin America. But it's a big illusion to think that the United States is retreating from other parts of the world into the Western Hemisphere. I just again want to take you some examples of this. One, which is the most clear, is obviously on the question of China. And again, I'll read you from the defense strategy. The National Security Strategy directs the Department of War to maintain a favorable balance of military power in the Indo-Pacific. It specifically states regarding China, we will erect a strong denial defense along the first island chain. It's absurd to suggest that the United States is retreating into the Western Hemisphere when it's attempting to create military build-up barriers a few hundred kilometers away from China, when this across the entire thousands of kilometers of the Pacific Ocean. Regarding Taiwan, it says there, this is again from the security strategy, a favorable conventional military balance remains an essential component of strategic competition. There is rightly much focus on Taiwan because Taiwan provides direct access to the second island chain and splits Northeast and Southeast Asia into two distinct theatres. Preserving military overmatch is a priority. There's no sign whatever of retreat from that. And it makes also, I could read you many more quotes, but I won't do, on Europe. It says that it's going to run down forces in Europe in order to redeploy them to the situation in China. What is the tactics behind Trump? It's very simple. He's found out that he faces two opponents who are strong. The United States is losing the war in Ukraine, which was created by the invasion, by the attempt to expand NATO, and it lost to the United States lost to China in the tariff war. Therefore, what it's decided to do is, therefore, as it's been temporarily set back in these attacked countries, it's going to attack countries in the global south, which it believes are weaker, because that way it can deal with its current problems militarily, and it can also therefore hope to isolate China and Russia in the future. This incident is not merely therefore a military threat against the countries of the global south, although it is most urgent and most seriously. In particular, I draw attention not merely to what has been stressed on Venezuela, but the attempt to starve Cuba into submission and to try to return it to the hellhole run by the mafia and criminal gangs, etc., and the scum of the earth who ruled Cuba before 1959. And that's what's attempting to do. The United States also attempting to build up, it prioritizes the Iron Dome, that's its anti-ballistic missile system. What is this? This is not a defensive system. This is a system for a first strike. The idea of the Iron Dome is that at the present time, the United States is inhibited from launching nuclear war because it would be struck by nuclear retaliation. If it can, on the country, launch a first strike and have an anti-ballistic missile system which can take out the 50 or 100 missiles which may be launched, then it will not be so concerned about launching a nuclear war. So therefore, the threat of the United States is not merely to the global south, although it is very directly to the global south, and it is most urgently to the global south. And the question of the defense of Venezuela, the defense of Cuba, the defense of Iran, and after we've seen what the United States has done in Israel, supporting Israel in Gaza, that's the most urgent question. But it's not going to stop there. The United States is in a military build-up, which raises the very real threat of nuclear war, because that's what it's preparing itself for. We are on a path which, if it is not stopped, really threatens the world with a world war. I think the comparisons to the situation in the 1930s are very valid. What happened, the fascists, after they succeeded in defeating Spain, after they succeeded in defeating the French Popular Front, then went on to attack, of course, the Soviet Union, and unleashed the greatest war in human history. We have to stop the United States getting to that point by defending the people who are under attack now. That is in Venezuela, Cuba, Iran, and the other countries. If they can be stopped there, then they won't dare to go further. So that is the most crucial thing. We have to take up all of these individual cases, starting off with Venezuela, Cuba, Iran, and those which are under direct attack, in addition to what's happened in Gaza. But we have to see them as part of an integrated process by which the United States is attempting to use its military power to offset its economic decline. And we shouldn't have any illusions that the United States will accept peacefully some division of the world into spheres of influence or any rise of multipolarity. Thank you very much indeed.
I mean, I'm putting in the chat a PDF of the National Security Strategy. I don't know if people have seen it. I would hope you have, but I've been talking to a lot of people recently about it, and it's not something that a lot of people seem to have seen at the moment. So I did quite a bit of looking at this document, which John has, John has done as well, and probably makes more sense. But I do think these are very important documents. One of them is allegedly written by Trump, although I'm not sure how much is really written, but it's in his name. The other one is written by Hegseth, and he's quite insane as far as I can pick up. They want to ensure that the Western Hemisphere remains reasonably stable and well governed enough to prevent and discourage mass migration to the United States. They want a hemisphere whose governments cooperate with them against narco-terrorists and cartels and other transnational criminal organizations. And we want a hemisphere that remains free of hostile foreign incursions or ownership of key assets, and that supports critical supply chains. And we want to ensure our continued access to key strategic locations. It then says, in other words, we will assert and enforce the Trump corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. I mean, this is just insane. The Monroe Doctrine was, 200 years ago. And, thankfully, it hasn't had any sort of significance until he's now reinvented it, not only in real life, but he calls it the Donroe Doctrine. They want to halt and reverse the ongoing damage that foreign actors inflict on the American economy while keeping the Indo-Pacific free and open, preserving freedom of negotiation in all crucial sea lanes and maintaining secure and reliable supply chains with access to critical materials. Basically, they want China back to where it was, if not before October the 1st, 1949, then at least in 1912. After years of neglect, the United States will reassert and enforce that doctrine across the whole of the Western Hemisphere. And, you know, they don't seem to have any concept of that, you know, this is not something that they can do now. Their goals for the Western Hemisphere can be summarized as enlist and expand. They will enlist established friends in the hemisphere to control migration, stop drug flows, and strengthen stability and security on land and sea. We will expand by cultivating and strengthening new partners while bolstering our own nation's appeal as a hemisphere economic and security partner of choice. Trump attempts to destabilize and sow discord through threats that violate international law. Military attacks against numerous states in Latin America, West Asia, and even NATO ally Denmark are an expression of the crisis of the leading power of international capitalism. His deranged demands have one goal: to prevent the collapse of US hegemony. The United Nations and other organizations, international law and international treaties are now being blatantly disregarded. The law of the strongest of might prevails. That is blatantly evident in the kidnapping of President Maduro, as well as in the continued support for Israel in the genocide and displacement of Palestinians, so as to appropriate all of their territories. The strategic adversary in all of this is, as John said, China. All future US imperialist transgressions are subordinate to this main struggle. The US is proving itself to be the greatest threat to peaceful relations and the greatest obstacle to solving global problems through international cooperation. The US policy of threats and actual war against China's oil and gas-rich partners like Venezuela and like the next one, which will be Iran, and to control strategic trade routes like Greenland, the Taiwan Strait, South China Sea, the Panama Canal. This is all an expression of an insane power struggle, which the US intends to win militarily through a massive increase in its military spending. Vast amounts of money are now going to be used to expand its nuclear arsenal, establish AI-controlled missile defense systems with space-based weapons, create destabilizing multi-domain task forces with precise strategic hypersonic weapons, and build a bigger, superior navy. I put the two reports in the chat, and I hope people get a chance to download them and read them. I do think we need to make much more of a noise about what is happening and show people what they are claiming to be their rights and their intentions for the next few years. It says in one of them, only the Department of War can provide the power to ensure that the nations, I mean, it's called now, not, you know, the army or whatever, it's the Department of War. They're going to provide the nation's interests are defended, and we will unapologetically do so. We will be our nation's sword and its shield, always ready to be wielded decisively at the president's direction, in service of this vision for lasting peace through strength. This National Defence Strategy, NDS, shows how. That is why the NSS directs the Department of War, the whole Department of Law, the Secretary of War, to maintain a favourable balance of military power in the Indo-Pacific, not for the purposes of dominating, humiliating or strangling China, it says. To the contrary, our goal is far more scoped and reasonable than that. It is simply to ensure that neither China nor anyone else can dominate us or our allies. This does not require regime change or some other existential struggle, rather a decent peace on terms favourable to the Americans, but that China can also accept and live under is possible. That is the wise premise of President Trump's visionary and realistic approach to diplomacy with Beijing. At the same time, the department's efforts will provide the undergirding strength for this approach. I don't think you need much more to hear to realise just what the game is currently planned for and what's going to happen. But these two documents, I think, should be, shown, circulated, talked about in every group that you can be in, and make sure that people are aware of what is going to happen. Thank you. Our final speaker is Maggie Simpson. Last but definitely not least, since retiring from work as a library assistant 2 years ago, Maggie has become invaluable as our convener, and she's been active in anti-war struggles, solidarity groups, anti-racist work, and labour movement campaigns for several decades. It's a great pleasure to ask you to finish off the speeches today. Maggie, over to you.
Thanks very much, Bob. I have to say that most of what I've got has already been covered by the other speakers, but I'll go ahead anyway because, I've got my own sort of slight different take on things. So the background to the US war drive is its long-term economic decline at the same time as the economic rise of China. On current economic trends, the US would be qualitatively overtaken by China in the next 10 to 20 years. Hence, the absolute imperative for US imperialism's military aggression to maintain its hegemony. Currently, the US cannot stop or exceed China's growth, but its military remains by far the most powerful in the world. In 2026, Trump has increased the US military budget from 1 to 1.5 trillion and has already been said combined, greater than the combined totals of the next 10 highest military spending nations. Pressure on imperialism and the extent of its military and soft power responses, using all the tools in its arsenal, means that the gangster character of imperialism can no longer be hidden or attempt to be hidden. So US imperialism now completely undermines existing international and humanitarian law and the rules-based order. This has meant genocide in Gaza, the massacre of millions in wars against Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, Syria, and Ukraine, and theft, piracy, seizures, kidnapping, and murders. As Tricontinental's hyper-imperialism document elaborates in this era, all other imperialist countries support US imperialism, whatever the cost to their own economies and populations. Even on Greenland, initial outrage was soon ameliorated. At the same time, multipolarity led by China continues apace through the Belt and Road Initiative, BRICS, Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and these forces and other such vehicles, and these forces support the UN and international law. But resistance by its main adversaries, Russia militarily and China economically, means that the US thus far has been unable to defeat either country nor undo their alliance. So US imperialism, whilst maintaining its military build-up in the South China Sea and its proxy war against Russia in Ukraine, with the despicable support of European allies, is turning its military aggression against weaker countries. This is codified in the National Security Strategy for 2026. And while some on the left have seized on its turn to the Western Hemisphere as an indication of US acceptance of multipolarity, the strategy document remains clear that the central intention is to contain and defeat China. And that's not to say, as other speakers have indicated, the very, very serious attempt to sort of retain its hegemony in Latin America and elsewhere. A turn by the US empire to defeat weaker countries was presaged in 2023, when it had already become clear that it was being defeated on the Ukrainian battlefield. In this context, the US-Israeli attacks and genocide on Gaza were a gift to the imperialist ghouls. They could now move to defeat an impoverished, occupied, blockaded people with utter ferocity, as well as attack and in some cases defeat Palestinian allies in West Asia, Hezbollah, the Assad government, Yemen and Iran. The Palestinians have suffered a terrible defeat and now face the monstrous board of peace, which includes no Palestinians, but stuffed and controlled by Trump and cronies who seek to recreate Gaza as a playground of the elites. As Mika Erskog notes in a recent No Cold War article, which I'll post in the chat after, there is a National Committee for Gaza Management whose 15 members are Palestinian technocrats. All the major Palestinian factions are coordinating in this endeavor. And as Mika says, to quote, their pragmatic cooperation does not legitimize the board of peace. It demonstrates political maturity in distinguishing between survival imperatives and strategic objectives. This is the dialectic we must understand. Palestinians working within an unjust framework while maintaining commitment to transcending it, cooperating tactically while opposing strategically. I tend to think that similarly situation might beset Delcy Rodriguez government in Venezuela, as it has to negotiate maintaining the revolution in the face of the US attacks on it. Venezuela has been well covered by Francisco, and US actions for regime change against Cuba are of utmost concern. And again, solidarity will need to be intensified. I'll post in the chat Cuba Solidarity Campaign's emergency meeting notification for Tuesday evening. The courageous response of the people of these two small countries inspires the solidarity movements. US neocolonial regime change efforts are also about disrupting China's trade, investment and supply routes in the global south. Coincidentally, the US-Israeli military assault on Iran on 12 June 2025 started just after a breakthrough freight train journey from Tehran to Xi'an in China, cutting weeks off a sea journey and potentially opening a vast new trade route. Clearly, another US war on Iran is imminent. A major escalation of economic attacks by the US in December caused the Iranian currency to crash. The hardship that followed led to demonstrations on the streets, and the regime was in discussion with organizers. Into this situation, CIA and Mossad armed thugs started killing and maiming people, thousands of them, and clearly the regime responded. Then many millions of Iranians demonstrated across the country in support of their government. But imperialist propaganda across all its media networks promoted the myth that the Iranian security forces were attacking people critical of the regime and that regime change was needed. Astonishingly, some on the left accepted this propaganda. There were no anti-war actions against the imperialist offensive, but Iranian monarchists accompanied by Israeli flags and Union Jacks were on the streets of Britain. Fortunately, as the nature of the propaganda is exposed, there is a rollback of those supporting it and a move to oppose any US war on Iran. In my view, the anti-imperialist position should be no US war on Iran, end sanctions on Iran, and support Iran's sovereignty. Finally, we should note that imperialism's external aggression is combined with repression domestically. No wonder, as the vast costs of their military operations are met by their populations via cuts to welfare, public services, and other progressive policies. Many oppose the imperialist brutality and oppression from their own understanding of humanity, as well as the existential risks to civilization, as we know are posed by ever-increasing wars. The opposition of working class and marginalized groups in the imperialist centers and to their government's involvement in US-led wars and aggressions and domestic anti-immigration policies is a vital contribution alongside the immense fight back of populations under attack in countries of the global south. The courage of people in Minneapolis and elsewhere in the US has been inspiring as they face armed and deadly government thugs on their streets. Likewise, protesters in European cities have been under police attacks and legal actions as they stand up for Palestine. But we face imperialism, which is white supremacist, neo-colonial, racist, and utterly ruthless to its core. These are times when solidarity and opposition to warmongering will be ongoing and crucial. And I'm sure that No Cold War and No Cold War Britain, with the links across the global south, will continue to make an important contribution to these struggles. Thanks very much for listening, and I'm looking forward to the discussion. Thanks.